This is a short introduction to the social history theme in our Palolo project. If you've picked, there's a set of specific tasks that we have that we want people to undertake. And in most cases, you'd be doing just one of these. What we're looking at very specifically is the actual history of events that occurred in the valley. This would largely be held in newspaper archives. And again, as you noticed in the proposal, there's a bunch of really good resources, but they're not particularly searchable in the sense that you'd have to use a lot of different types of words, including, for example, and maybe street names, to actually try to find all this stuff. So it's going to, again, as with some of these other, in fact, most of the other approaches, a lot is going to be sort of like detective work. This is classic research. You're trying to find out something that no one else has ever looked at in this particular way. And you're having used existing resources to try to get there. This part of town, as with much of Honolulu, especially in the 19th to 20th century, they were real free and loose about the place names. If you notice at the end of this proposal, we've got an advertisement for the Kaimuki Land Company, but that was actually Wilhelmina Rise, and that wasn't Kaimuki by any one stretch of the imagination. My suspicion is they did that for marketing reasons. So I have no idea what type of use of the word Palolo or Pukele, for example, or Wild Mile might be in terms of where those places could be. But that's what we want to look at in this particular theme. We want to look at what is the actual social history of this particular part of the island in the last couple of 100 years. Now, there's several tiers of this. One, if you're Hawaiian competent, as with the oral traditions thing, would be to look at the Hawaiian language newspapers. These are an incredibly rich resource. They're by the day literally getting more of these scanned in. So they're actually pretty accessible nowadays. They're not necessarily particularly easy to read if you're Hawaiian like mine. It tends to be something you have to sort of think about. But if you're real competent in Hawaiian and you get used to sort of shifting back to an 1840s, 1850s version of Hawaiian especially, there's a ton of stuff in there. I have a deep suspicion that there's a lot of stuff on the social history in the Hawaiian language newspapers, not the least of which, of course, is you have to remember that in the 1895 counter-revolution, some of that actually happened here in Palolo. So I'm really convinced that, for example, in the Hawaiian language newspapers from, say, 1891 to especially 1896, 1897, there would be a fair amount of articles about things that happened in Palolo just because it was, sort of pertinent at the time. So that would be one approach. One other task would be looking at actual events in the English language newspapers, again, from the first starts in print in English in the 1830s, and then they've gone all the way through today. So what things have ever happened in Palolo-Pukele? Now, as far as we're concerned, the way we're looking at this project, more and more it's becoming clear that to a certain extent, Maunalani Heights, Wilhelmina Rise are actually sort of part of Palolo. I'm not sure about St. Louis Heights, but for our purposes, we'll probably use that the two ridges and the valley between rather than just saying Palolo proper in the center. So both for Hawaiian language and for this theme, think of this whole area. We're less interested in Kaimuki because that's always been a very clearly defined thing that's separate from Palolo. But St. Louis Heights and Wilhelmina Rise are modern terms, and we don't have any particularly distinct terms for those ridges. So we can sort of assume they might have been seen as part of Palolo into maybe the 20th century. Another theme, another task in this particular theme is most of Palolo, especially in the flat areas, is subdivisions. When did those subdivisions get built? How were they marketed? What were they called? What were they trying to sell them as? In other words, how big were the lots? What type of buildings were they saying? What type of cost? In other words, how were these being spun? How was a developer trying to attract people to live in Palolo in these different developments? These again would be in the newspapers in terms of ads. I'm not sure if those shows up. Well, yeah, no, they do show up in the search engine. So at least in the English language newspapers, those should be available. I would suspect the developments would probably be limited to the English language newspapers. I usually look at the early Hawaiian language newspapers, but I don't remember seeing a lot of ads for development type stuff. That was much more a sort of English speaking population thing. Who did the initial developments? In other words, if you have these developments that we're looking at, one of the other things that would be tied to this, or maybe part of the same task, I'm not really too sure, we'll wait and see what you guys start to find, is who are these people? In other words, we want to know actually sort of like their biographical or work business history. If they were doing development in Palolo, were they developing other parts? For example, were they doing developments in Kapahula or Kaimuki, where else? So what pattern do we have of developments in this whole part of the island from these folks? Was it maybe one group of guys that did all the developments? Was it different people? Who knows? And to be honest, we don't know any of this right now. Next would be, when you're looking at this, especially post World War II, and this is because of the Carlos Long subdivision in the back of the Palolo Valley, what developments happened after World War II, and how, if at all, were they different than the earlier developments, and where did they happen? My suspicion is that with the post-World War II, what you see is lots being sold, but maybe not buildings built. But I could be entirely wrong. Again, we don't know. We need to have this nailed down. And the last would be, we know from virtue of early accounts, and especially the 1993 thing on Palolo, that the Carlos Long subdivision was actually marketed very specifically to veterans, and largely Japanese American veterans post World War II. But who actually built that subdivision? Who developed that subdivision? And for example, how was it marketed to veterans? What type of advertisements did they use? Was there some sort of a special deal if you were a vet that you got a special rate, or how was this spun? How did this play out? Was this unique to Palolo? Are there other parts, especially on this side of the island, that you had similar post-World War II developments that were targeted specifically to returning vets? And if so, where were they, and how was that set up? So those are the different tasks. Some of them sort of interrelate, number 4 and 5, but many of them are pretty different. So again, these are going to be sort of long-term studies. And in some cases, especially the Hawaiian and English language newspaper events, you're going to have to take chunks of years and just go through bunga, bunga, bunga. You're not going to get it done. But we need people to do all these different things. If no other reason, we can at least start to get a better idea of what actually happened in Palolo over the last couple of hundred years that we have in print and newspapers.